Your stomach had stopped hurting 3 days ago. That's when you knew you were in real trouble. Hunger pain meant your body was still fighting. When the pain stopped, it meant your body was shutting down, conserving what little energy remained. You sat against a stone wall in an alley that smelled like rotten sewage. Your clothes were rags so thin you could see through them. It was February. The cold cut through you like knives. Your feet were bare, the skin cracked and bleeding. You de-soled your shoes 2 weeks ago for a piece of bread. Now you had nothing left to sell except your body, and you'd already tried that. No one wanted you. You were too thin, too sick, too close to death. You held out your hand as people passed. Most didn't look. A few spat. One man kicked you and told you to get work. You were 12 years old. You'd been living on the streets for 8 months. And you knew with absolute certainty that you wouldn't survive another week. The 1600s across England and much of Europe saw poverty at levels that are almost impossible to comprehend today. Entire populations lived on the edge of starvation. One bad harvest, one illness, one accident, and you were on the streets with no way back. There was no safety net. No government assistance. No shelters or soup kitchens. If you couldn't work, you starved. If you couldn't pay rent, you were evicted. And once you hit the streets, the system was designed to keep you there. Begging was technically illegal in most places. Laws called the Vagrancy Acts made it a crime to be poor and homeless. You could be arrested for having no visible means of support. The punishment was whipping, branding, or being locked in stocks for days while people threw refuse at you. But you had to beg anyway because the alternative was death. So you broke the law every day just by existing. The streets were filled with beggars. Children, women, men, elderly people, all fighting for the same scraps. Competition was vicious. The best begging spots were controlled by gangs. If you tried to work someone else's corner, you'd be beaten or worse. Churches offered some charity, but it was never enough. A bowl of thin soup once a day if you were lucky. Maybe a piece of bread. But churches had limited resources and thousands of mouths to feed. Most of the time you went hungry. Margaret Fletcher was 10 when her mother died. Her father had died years earlier. She had no other family, no one to take her in. She'd been living in a single room with her mother, surviving on her mother's work as a seamstress. When her mother caught fever and died within a week, Margaret was left with nothing. The landlord threw her out immediately. Couldn't pay rent, couldn't stay. Margaret ended up on the streets of London with literally nothing but the clothes she wore. She tried to find work. She was willing to do anything, but no one hired children without references. No one wanted a homeless girl who looked half-starved and desperate, so she begged. She found a spot near a church where well-dressed people passed on their way to services. She held out her hand and asked for help. Most people ignored her. Some told her to pray harder. A few gave her a coin, but it was never enough. 1 penny might buy a small piece of bread. It would be gone in minutes, and then the hunger returned, worse than before. Margaret learned quickly that survival on the streets required rules. Never fall asleep in the open. Other street people would rob you, take whatever you had, sometimes kill you. Find a hidden spot, a doorway or alley, and stay alert. Never trust anyone. Every person was competition. Every act of kindness could be a trap. The cold was the worst part. Summer brought its own miseries, the heat and the flies and the stench of the city, but winter killed. You couldn't escape it. Margaret had no blanket, no coat, nothing to protect her from the freezing temperatures. She'd huddle in doorways trying to find spots where the wind didn't cut as sharply. She'd press against buildings, stealing warmth from the stone. Sometimes she'd find other street children and they'd huddle together, sharing body heat. But you couldn't trust them. Margaret woke one morning to find another girl trying to steal the ragged shawl she'd wrapped around herself. They fought. Margaret won, but barely. Her hands were scratched and bleeding. The other girl disappeared into the maze of alleys. Margaret never saw her again. The streets taught you that survival meant selfishness. Helping others could get you killed. You protected what little you had with violence if necessary. Compassion was a luxury no one could afford. Margaret watched children younger than her die on the streets. Cold, starvation, disease. Their bodies would lie where they'd fallen until someone from the parish came to collect them. If no one claimed them, they were buried in mass graves. No names, no markers, just holes in the ground filled with the forgotten dead. Nobody cared. That was the reality Margaret faced every single day. She'd beg from people who had more food than they could eat, more clothes than they could wear, more money than they'd spend in a lifetime. And they'd walk past her like she didn't exist. Sometimes they'd complain that beggars were ruining the neighborhood. They'd call for constables to clear the streets, to arrest the vagrants, to make the problem disappear. As if poverty was something you could simply sweep away. As if homeless children were trash to be discarded. Margaret tried going to churches for help beyond the occasional bowl of soup. She'd heard that some offered shelter, but the reality was different. Churches would sometimes take in orphans, but only if you could prove you were deserving. If you could demonstrate good Christian character. Margaret was dirty, half-wild from months on the streets, desperate and angry. She didn't look deserving. She looked like what she was, a child the system had destroyed. So the churches turned her away, told her to pray. Told her that suffering was God's will and she should bear it with patience. Told her that if she was truly faithful, Providence would provide. Providence didn't provide. The streets provided nothing but suffering and the slow certainty of death. If you were Margaret, 10 years old and alone on the streets with winter closing in, what would you have done? Would you have kept begging, kept hoping someone would help, even as the evidence piled up that no one would? Or would you have made choices that went against everything you'd been taught, just to survive one more day? Disease moved through the street population like a scythe through wheat. With no shelter, no clean water, no sanitation, illness was constant and deadly. Margaret got sick in her 7th month on the streets. Started as a cough. Within days, she had fever, chills, difficulty breathing. It might have been influenza, might have been pneumonia. There was no way to know and no one to help her figure it out. She couldn't beg when she was sick. She could barely move. She found a corner behind a butcher's shop where they dumped waste and huddled there, shaking with fever. Other beggars avoided her. Sickness was contagious and everyone was already so weak that any illness could be fatal. Margaret was alone, completely alone. She thought she was going to die there behind that shop, surrounded by rotting meat scraps and flies, but she didn't. After 5 days, the fever broke. She survived, but the illness left her weaker. Her lungs never fully recovered. She coughed constantly. Her body couldn't handle the cold as well, and winter was just beginning. But here's what makes the whole system even more cruel. The people who could have helped chose not to. This wasn't ignorance. Everyone knew about the street children. Everyone saw them begging. Everyone walked past their bodies when they died. This was deliberate. There was a widespread belief that poverty was a moral failing, that if you were poor, it was because you were lazy, sinful, or cursed by God. Helping the poor was seen as enabling their bad behavior. If you gave them food, they'd never learn to work. If you gave them shelter, they'd never try to better themselves. This belief was so deeply ingrained that it shaped laws and social policy. The Vagrancy Acts weren't just about maintaining order. They were about punishing poverty, about making being poor so unbearable that people would do anything to escape it. The logic was insane. There weren't enough jobs. Wages were too low to live on. Children couldn't legally work in most trades, but none of that mattered. If you were on the streets, it was your fault. And society's job wasn't to help you. It was to make your life hell until you either pulled yourself up or died trying. Think about the social programs that exist now. Homeless shelters, food banks, child protective services, welfare. Now imagine all of that gone. Imagine a society that believes helping the poor is morally wrong, that watching children starve is preferable to enabling laziness. Could you live in that society? Could you walk past a dying child and tell yourself they deserved it? Most street children didn't last a year. The combination of starvation, exposure, disease, and violence killed them quickly. Margaret made it 10 months, longer than most. She survived by being clever, vicious when necessary, and willing to do things she never would have imagined before. She stole when opportunities arose. Small things, food from market stalls, a coin from an unattended purse. She was caught twice. The first time, the shopkeeper beat her and threw her into the street. The second time, she was arrested. They locked her in a cell for 3 days with no food. Then they brought her before a magistrate. He asked if she understood that theft was a sin. Margaret, starving and exhausted, said she understood, but she'd had no choice. Wrong answer. The magistrate sentenced her to public whipping. She received 20 lashes in the town square. She was 11 years old. The whip tore her back open. She couldn't lie down for days without agony. The wounds got infected. She had no way to treat them. Margaret died in March, almost a year after her mother's death. She was found in an alley, curled into a ball, her body stiff with cold. The infection from the whipping had spread. Fever had consumed what little strength she had left. She'd probably been dead for 2 days before anyone noticed. A constable had her body taken away. She was buried in a pauper's grave with no name, no marker, nothing to indicate she'd ever existed. She was 11 years old. Her entire life had been reduced to a year of suffering on the streets, punishment for the crime of being born into poverty and losing the only person who'd cared for her. The streets didn't empty. Margaret's death changed nothing. Other children took her spot. Other beggars fought over the same corners. The system that had killed her continued unchanged because it was working exactly as intended. The vagrancy laws stayed in place. The charitable organizations remained underfunded and overwhelmed, and society continued to believe that poverty was a personal failure rather than a systemic problem. The wealthy lived comfortable lives, attended church, donated small amounts to charity, and felt virtuous. They could look at the beggars and tell themselves that they'd done their part, that if these people were still suffering, it was their own fault. The fact that the system was designed to make escape impossible, that children were dying not from lack of resources, but from lack of will to distribute those resources fairly, none of that penetrated the comfortable lies people told themselves. Even when attitudes began to shift, when some reformers started arguing that poverty had structural causes, the changes came too slowly to save the generations already on the streets. By the time workhouses were established, they were designed to be punitive rather than helpful. By the time child labor laws were passed, millions of children had already died from the exploitation. The 1600s killed vast numbers of poor people through deliberate policy and societal indifference, and that fact was quietly buried under narratives about progress and moral improvement. We remember the cathedrals built during this era, the art produced, the scientific advances. We don't remember the children who died in alleys, the beggars who froze on church steps, the people society decided weren't worth saving. Their suffering made everything else possible. The stable social order, the concentration of wealth, the grand monuments, all of it built on the quiet acceptance that some people's lives simply didn't matter, and that acceptance never really went away. It just learned new language, found new justifications, and continued deciding who deserves help and who deserves to suffer. The streets of the 1600s are gone, but the impulse that filled them with dying children remains, waiting for any moment when society decides that cruelty is easier than compassion.